So the first way that we're going to talk about fallacies is by identifying those that are problematic because they are fallacies of irrelevance. Now this really is focusing in on the first consideration of what makes an argument good. So you may recall that the arguments that we look at really can fail on three different fronts. One, the premises could fail to support the conclusion. So maybe the premises are true, but they actually don't lead to the conclusion because they're not relevant to the conclusion. And the second way that an argument can be or needs to be good, the second condition for a good argument, is that the premises actually have to be true. So maybe you do have sentences that support a conclusion or are connected to the conclusion, but they're not actually true. So it doesn't matter that they support the conclusion because they're not true. So we're dealing with the first set. These are ones in which somebody presents an argument and they say something and then suggest that therefore you should believe something else, but the things that are being stated to support the conclusion don't actually connect to the conclusion. Even if they're true, the conclusion could still be false. And so there's several of these, so we may just refer to this video as part A of fallacies of irrelevance. All right, so let's discuss these. Probably the most famous, or the ones that when people think of fallacies, they often first think of, let me go with a smaller pin type here. They first think of ad hominem fallacies. Oops, I spelled that wrong. This is an I, H-O-M-E, H-O-M-I-N-E-M. Okay. So an ad hominem fallacy basically follows this pattern. Now notice I'm using the word pattern instead of the word form because these are not formal or deductive fallacies. These are fallacies of informal reasoning, meaning that the stuff that's cited is supposed to provide probability that the conclusion is true, so it's more of an inductive type of thinking, but even in that sense, they fail to actually support the conclusion. So the first is the ad hominem, and it has this pattern. First it says basically something bad about person P. And then they want you to conclude, so P is wrong. All right. It's not going to follow this exact form, but here's the way it might fill in the blanks. So premise one, Senator so-and-so is cheating on his wife. Secondly, Senator so-and-so supports legislation L. So L is bad, or we should vote against legislation L. So something along these lines. It could be something like the city council is moving to do this, but we know that the city council is packed with people and businessmen who cheat on their taxes, so therefore we should oppose this next move. Now notice, what's the problem with this? Because people are often motivated by this sort of reasoning. The idea is this, that whether someone is cheating on their wife, no matter how bad that is irrelevant to whether this legislation ought to be passed. So we're often deceived in thinking that there's some connection between these two things, so we accept the conclusion, but if it's irrelevant, then we need to see it as such and recognize that that argument is not good. Now, with all fallacies, there is the potential that something that looks like a fallacy actually isn't. And here's why an ad hominem, something that appears to be an ad hominem, might not be a fallacy. Let's say that, let me erase this here. Go send something else. Oops. Let's say the premise one is still Senator so-and-so is cheating on his wife. And then premise two, I don't even know that we need a premise two in this one. Just say the conclusion. So we shouldn't put Senator so-and-so on the ethics committee. Okay, now you might think that the premise actually does have some relevance or connection to the conclusion. So Senator so-and-so is cheating on his wife. Presumably if you're cheating on your wife, you're not a person who makes good ethical judgments, so we shouldn't put person S or Senator so-and-so on the ethics committee. Has the appearance of being an ad hominem because it's something bad about the person, so therefore we should conclude this. But in this instance, it is actually relevant. So just because it seems to look like a fallacy, we always want to make sure that we're checking on, does the premise really follow from the conclusion? And oftentimes when people are saying something bad about another person's character, they're not actually connecting it to the conclusion. Now, this particular type of fallacy we've been discussing is called the abusive ad hominem. It's where you just make some general character attack against the person. There are other types of ad hominem fallacies that are not nearly as, not as direct as attacking the person, like a direct attack against the person's character, but still an attack against the person sort of indirectly. So I'm going to mention those two. So remember, the first one we've just discussed was the abusive ad hominem. The second type we will call the circumstantial ad hominem. The circumstantial is the ad hominem. I'll just go and write it out here. Where you might call it a conflict of interest type of fallacy. It could go something like this. So, Pastor so-and-so says we should come to church. However, Pastor so-and-so will benefit from us going to church. So therefore, he's wrong. Or I just didn't want to write out the whole thing. So therefore, it's not true that we should come to church or something like that. So notice the idea here is that he has some ulterior motive for saying that something is true, and so therefore we conclude that it must be false. So this is kind of an attack on his character, but a little more indirect, saying there's something that he stands to gain from it. But is it possible that even though he will benefit from us coming to church, that this is still true? Yes, that's certainly possible. And sometimes people in that sort of scenario, so people who are close to it, actually know better than anybody else. So why is it that we tend to be skeptical of people who do benefit from the things that they say? Well, I guess we probably think that there is a chance that they would be more tempted to say something false, even if they knew that it was true. But his being or benefiting from our church attendance is not relevant to whether we should attend church. So this is a fallacy of irrelevance, and it's specifically the ad hominem. All right, one last type of ad hominem, which is the tu quoque ad hominem, or what we might call the hypocritical ad hominem. Well, it's not the ad hominem that's hypocritical, but it's the accusation of hypocrisy that's doing the work here. So this is spelled, tu quoque, and it goes something like this. Let's see. Albert says that we should save fossil fuels or limit fossil fuel use. However, Albert travels extensively using gas. So he's wrong. So notice, just because someone travels extensively using gas does not mean that it's false, that we should limit our usage of gas, but we tend to hold people skeptical when it feels like they don't actually behave according to what they say is true. Of course, there could be any number of reasons why this could be true, and yet this is still the right thing to do. But again, we're persuaded often to move from those premises to that conclusion when those don't guarantee for sure, and they may not even make it probable that Albert is wrong. All right, so those are three types of ad hominem fallacies. A second type of fallacy is called the straw man. A straw man fallacy has this pattern, and it's a little harder to create because you have to know how the person is reacting, or the comments of the person that's person presenting the straw man is reacting to. So this usually will happen kind of in dialogue or in response to something that somebody else said. So maybe somebody has made a pitch about something and they're trying to get you to believe something. Then the straw man fallacy is a response where it's a reconstruction of the original argument that is bad. It's not an accurate reconstruction. It's not fair, charitable. It actually doesn't present the other person's argument accurately. And then 2, there's a rejection of the bad argument. And so we reject the original position. So you probably heard this happen plenty of times where somebody's making a point, and then somebody else will respond to that point by describing it or characterizing their argument in a way that's not at all what the original person intended. Maybe it's completely an inaccurate representation, but then they show that that argument, the bad version of the argument, is actually bad, and then they reject the other person's position. So notice, a bad reconstruction of another person's argument is not a relevant reason for getting to this conclusion, so it's a fallacy. All right. The third one that we're going to discuss, I guess there was 3 ad hominems, so this is kind of the 5th one, is the red herring fallacy. And a red herring, in some ways, all fallacies function kind of like a red herring fallacy, and it'll make more sense as I say it here in a second. So a red herring fallacy pattern is something like this. Again, you were having an original conversation or an original, somebody was maybe defending a position. So kind of like the straw man, it's in response to something somebody else is saying. And so then the argument against the person is a changing of the subject. Sometimes you even make a really strong point on this new subject, and then conclude that the original argument, original position was wrong. So notice this is even worse than a straw man. The straw man sort of is a semblance of the original argument, but it's a bad reconstruction, and then you point out that your reconstruction is a bad argument, attribute it to the original person, and then reject it. This is, in some ways, it's just a strange fallacy, but you do see it happen a lot where people will, somebody will be talking about something, somebody else just drops a new subject in the conversation, maybe gets everybody worked up, and then treats the end of the conversation as if they were victorious in responding to or rejecting the original person's position. I think we tend to see this sometimes. I'm not sure how much you guys still pay attention to like comment sections of like online discussions. But this is what people I think are referencing when they talk about someone trolling a conversation. So they just drop something in there that's just a hot button topic and they get everybody distracted and they act like they've won the conversation. It's a red herring fallacy, and when you recognize that it's happening, you can call it as such. I should point out that memorizing these fallacy names is not really what's so important to me. What's important to me is you recognize when somebody's giving you reasons that don't actually lead to a conclusion so that you don't accept the conclusion. And you also recognize when something does lead to a conclusion so that you do find it more persuasive. So those are the first 3 fallacies that we're going to discuss. We'll have one more video where we discuss another 4 fallacies of irrelevance.